you for letting me. Hi, Amanda. It's so wonderful to be back here again. We're we're really chuffing along, aren't we, with all these topics? It's just incredible. I was thinking about it this morning when I was preparing myself for today, how much you can talk about trauma, and really, we're still just skimming the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this episode is going to be airing on October 17th, and we got started all the way back in February of this year. So, this
Yeah.
is our 18th episode. And we are going strong with enough subject material to go for a couple of years.
It's amazing, isn't it? How in depth you can get, and yet just still skimming the surface. But anyway,
Absolutely.
today we're talking about hypervigilance as a trauma response, and this is something that I've personally experienced. So, watch out. Today's episode might bring out some personal little anecdotes. I don't know.
It definitely might for both of us. I've been through a lot of that myself. So,
Yeah, yeah.
in the simplest terms, what is hypervigilance?
Well, basically, it's a heightened awareness of your surroundings, and you're on a high alert, feeling that there's a sense of danger around you all the time. That's probably
Right.
the simplest way of defining it.
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Um, it's amazing how completely exhausting this can be. And a lot of people don't realize that. They think hypervigilance only happens when you sense danger, but that's not a trauma response. That's a red flag alert. You need to pay attention to that. But if you
Mm,
have hypervigilance as a trauma response, it is 24 hours a day. You can be sound asleep and wake up because a cat jumps off of the table and lands very softly on the floor.
mm,
And that
mm.
is something that I'm very well aware of. I have to sleep with earplugs now. I have lived in a
Wow.
constant state of hypervigilance for so many years because of what happened to me. It's
Mm,
amazing.
mm.
And it's exhausting, you know?
It is exhausting. Interestingly, like before we got on air, we were talking about my recent experience of acupuncture. And one of the reasons that I've been seeing an acupuncturist is because my body, I've just felt, is in constant fight flight mode. And even though I've been, doing lots of wonderful things that we've talked about over the course of this year, um, I was finding that I was waking up in the middle of the night and my whole body was pulsating, and my heart rate was up, and pulse was up, and I was stiff, and I couldn't understand why. And I was feeling, aches and pains. So I went along to this acupuncturist who was recommended to me, and he said to me, "You have adrenal fatigue." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, have you experienced stress lately?" I said, "Well, I had a pretty stressful life," and listed the things that I'd live experienced of. And he said, "Yeah, your whole system, your major organs, your everything is just in overdrive all the time." And he said, "What we're going to be doing is calming your body down and getting it back to a normal sort of homeostasis where it's not constantly hypervigilant." He used those words.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Mm,
He's acknowledging that it's not just part of your mind, it is actually part of your body.
mm,
It's
mm,
nice to hear that because there's a lot of people that don't want to acknowledge that the two are so interconnected, and they really are. I mean, hypervigilance is more than just having your brain scanning the room and ignoring your family or friends when, you're trying to figure out if there's something aggressive that's around you. You know,
mm.
it is also very much a physical thing too. It can cause all kinds of
Completely.
issues. So a lot of times with people are hyper vigilant. Let's see if you have the same issue I do. I overreact to loud sounds. So constant
Hmm.
the elevated drums that I hear at church, if they boost
Yes.
the sound of the drums and it gets so loud, I have to leave the building. I can't stay.
Mm,
And
mm,
it's loud bangs, sounds, unexpected noises, smells that might
mm.
trigger a memory can make me very
Yeah.
hypervigilant. I can get really agitated. I can get irritated. I have snapped at my husband while we're at church because there's drums going off and I don't make the connection at the time. I just know that something's driving me
Mm,
crazy and I need to go. I need to go. I need to go right now. And it's that
mm,
hypervigilance. And I've also learned that a lot of people confuse hypervigilance with empathy. Have you?
mm, mm. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah.
Right. So when you walk into a room, you think you're empathetic enough to understand who the most damaged, hurt person is in the room, and you want to make them feel better. When really it's hypervigilance telling you this is the most dangerous person in the room. And if you don't appease them, they will hurt you.
Yeah.
There's a huge
Yeah.
difference between the two. The number and the percentage of the entire world that are actually empathetic souls is very small. The majority
Mm,
of people who believe they're empaths are actually abuse survivors or victims who are hypervigilant.
yes. Yes. It's really fascinating. I've had I've given this a lot of thought, actually, particularly in the last couple of years, doing my own sort of kind of self-analysis and working out, who am I as a human being? Because I used to consider myself as a highly empathic person. And, I am empathic, but I think I'm on the scale of hypervigilance rather than empathy as such, you know.
Right.
Um,
It can't be
and
both.
so well, you can be both. You can be both. But for me, I've realized, particularly when I saw this acupuncturist recently, just how hypervigilant my body still is. And it really is a body response. And just as another example, I was in a very toxic relationship at one point in my life, and I didn't realize just how toxic the relationship was until I was out of it. But while I was there, um, I spent probably a good 2.5 years completely hypervigilant. And at
Wow.
one point, um, like I was walking 6 to 10 kilometers a day simply because my body was just coursing with adrenaline and cortisol. And I just couldn't sit. I had to walk. And even when I got back home after that, I was still uptight. And we got to a point where I would go to bed at night with gaslighters in my hand because I was so afraid. But this person had not done anything like to physically hurt me or anything like that. But my body sensed that this wasn't a very safe person to be. And it
Right.
was giving me all these little hints, but it took a while for me to figure that one out.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when you are in a perfectly safe situation, your brain and your hypervigilance can often tell you that you're not. You know,
Hmm.
there's a lot of details that happen around us that a lot of people who do not have hypervigilance don't recognize. And I
Yeah.
see this so often with my husband where he just completely doesn't pay attention to things like subtle body language or the tone of
Mm,
someone's voice or their mood and expression on their face. And I pay attention to all
mm.
these things and it might be just a very brief little flash, but I'll spot it. And I was like, did you
Yes.
notice XYZ? No, I didn't notice. We'll talk
Yeah.
about it. Well, I don't know how right. I don't know if you're right about this one. Usually it turns out later on I was right. Something was
Yeah.
wrong and
Yeah.
they needed to talk to somebody about it. And
Yeah.
it is one of those trauma reactions that's really very handy to have, but at the same
Mm.
time, you have to be able to limit it. You cannot let it take over your
Indeed.
life.
Indeed. Yeah. Like I taught for 33 years, and as a teacher you can pick up very quickly who are the kids that are hypervigilant, who've experienced some level of trauma to be like that. And they're constantly surveying the room. And usually they sit at the back of the classroom because that's where they feel safest, that there's a wall behind them, no one can come up behind them and hurt them.
Yep, that's me.
Um, yeah.
I
Yeah.
still do that to this day in restaurants, or if I'm meeting
Mm-hmm.
friends for coffee, I have to sit where I'm facing the door because I don't feel
Mm.
safe otherwise.
Yeah.
It's very,
Yeah.
very rare circumstances where I allow that to be anything different.
Mm.
And yeah,
Mm.
when we start breaking down some of the problems that this can cause, one of them is that we're constantly expecting people to hurt us. And with that, we can
Yes.
start looking at our friends as though we're expecting them to eventually betray us. So the
Mm.
hypervigilance directly links to trust issues with other people, whether they're friends, family, it doesn't
Yes.
matter.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does. And that trust issue goes back to those traumatic events because you were in a situation where you were completely unsafe and an event occurred, whatever that event was, where you were compromised
Yeah,
in some way.
absolutely. Yeah. And
And so,
the whole hypervigilance thing, if you are so busy paying attention to what is going on around you and you're looking for this danger, you can absolutely be ignoring lots of other stuff that's coming up, including dangerous things, because it doesn't
mm,
remind you and it doesn't trigger you based on your past.
yeah,
Absolutely ignoring red flags everywhere. I've done that
yeah.
too.
Oh, yes, yes. I put my hand up for that too. Oh gosh, it's. I mean, you have to laugh. For me, that's the way I deal with. That's my coping mechanism in terms of how things occurred in the past in my life and how it impacted me. To try and um, balance my views about the
Yeah.
past and accept it and just make sense of it so that it no longer impacts on me in the future. So
Yeah.
important. So if I laugh and listeners are thinking, why is she laughing? That's a bit of a trauma response, really.
Yep.
Yeah.
I do the same. So years ago, this is a bizarre story. Years ago, when I first got back from Scotland, I enrolled in jujitsu and like 3 different forms of martial arts. And I was doing this every week. I was constantly in some kind of martial arts class. And one
Mm,
day in jujitsu, I was paired up with a 12-year-old kid who was about my same size because I'm kind of small. I had lost a lot
hmm
of weight when I was in Scotland. So I was really petite. I'm only 5'6", and this 12-year-old kid's my same size. And while we're sparring, I get him in this lock and he can't break away from me. But while I'm holding him, and even though I'm in class, I am absolutely terrified because I have been
Oh,
so
wow.
trained that you don't fight back. And when you fight back, things are going to get worse because eventually they're
Mm,
not going to be dead and they will come after you because I don't have the heart
mm,
to actually kill somebody. And I know in my brain, while I'm holding this kid in this absolute lock that he can't break, he can't get away from me. I know without a doubt that I'm in a safe place. Nothing's going to happen to me, but that's not what my body is telling me.
mm.
So, without meaning to, I burst into this incredibly loud giggle. And this poor kid thought I was laughing at him and it humiliated him.
Oh,
I
no.
felt terrible. But at the same time, I have to own the fact that I had no idea what was going on. I had no clue.
Mm, mm,
I knew there was something wrong, but
mm.
didn't make any sense to me at the time. I don't know why I'm giggling at this. This is not funny.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I explained that to
So
him later
this is
on. It's a nervous reaction.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say this is probably a good point to try and introduce some of the impacts of hypervigilance that have, short-term, long-term impacts. So, what have you got on your little list today for us?
Oh boy, I've got a whole bunch. Um, One of the things is the lack of objectivity. So we can often read way too much into a situation. Um,
Mm,
that hypervigilance can turn regular conversations into arguments because of that. I do have an over awareness of trying to pay attention to what other people think when they look at me or what they see
mhm,
when they look at me. I'm
Mm.
constantly looking around me. I can be having a conversation with somebody face to face at a convention last week. I was having a conversation with somebody, and every time somebody walked past the hallway, I would stop and I would look. In the middle of a sentence, I would do this. And eventually, this person turned around and started looking behind them because they were getting paranoid that somebody was coming up to us.
Oh,
So,
wow.
um,
Yeah.
I can have this real problem with being jumpy or jittery. I
Mm.
occasionally have a real bad problem with sitting still. I mean, I'm sitting here twitching around all the time right now anyway, but that's because I talk with my hands. But when I get jumpy and jittery, it's because something has triggered me to be more hyper vigilant. Something's going
Mm.
on that I'm not comfortable with, and I can't sit still because I feel like I'm in danger.
Mm. Mm.
Um, it has caused me a real problem with trying new things or going places that I've never been before. So this is something that I didn't recognize as being a trauma response, but my mother had the same issue. We cannot walk into stores or restaurants that we've never been into before if we are alone. It is
Mm.
absolutely petrifying for us. I have forced myself over the years to move beyond that and
Yeah.
to do it anyway, but it is still an anxiety attack every time. And I have to count backwards from 10 before I can even get out of my car to walk into the place. It's kind of a weird thing to do, but that's
Wow.
my mother did the
I
same thing.
actually have sort of similar experiences. I don't like going into basements and particularly into basement stores. And I was once in Seattle with a fellow, and he said, I want to take you to, oh, is it Nordstrom or something? I can't remember the name of the store now. But anyway, that's by the by. And he said, I'll leave you down here. And as we were going down the escalator, I'm thinking, I don't feel comfortable here. And my body started reacting, the heart rate went up and
Mm-hmm.
I was feeling anxious. And as we went down, he said, oh, look, here's the women's section. Have a bit of a wander around. I'm going to go and have a look at the men's section. I'll be back shortly. And he was gone for what seemed to me hours. I was beside myself and I was constantly scanning the place, not recognizing anybody. The place was unfamiliar. Like even now, I can feel it in my body.
Wow.
It was awful. And he eventually came back about, I think it was about maybe 20 minutes or something, came back later, and I just let loose. I said, don't you ever leave me in a place like this again, I didn't want to come here. And
Oh
but
my
yeah, no, I look
gosh.
back on it now. It was actually a it was a PTSD hypervigilance response.
Absolutely, it was. That's bizarre.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you can recognize that now. But at the time, I mean, if you don't know what it is that you're dealing with, this is a whole new world.
Mm. I was hyperventilating
Oof.
to the point where I thought I was dying.
Wow. Wow.
Mm. It was not pleasant. So, I mean, that is an example of, something that's really acute that can occur if you experience hypervigilance as
Yeah.
a trauma response.
Yep. Absolutely. And that's been a big issue for many years for me in my life. And this is something that I've had to occasionally explain to my poor husband. Is this
Mm.
is something that I have to deal with. And now that we're married, you have to deal with it too.
Mm. 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 And I suppose that's a consequence of that as well, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It impacts on your interpersonal relationships.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
And
it's
often
a
for the long
challenge.
term. You know, this
Yes.
is this is definitely a long-term problem. I mean,
Mm.
if you can't have conversations because you are so distracted and you're unable to focus because you're focusing on everything else around you, this is an issue. You know,
Mm.
you need to keep yourself in check. Take a moment to go through the five senses technique, do the breathing exercise, do what you need to do to reground yourself and remind yourself, I am not in a dangerous place. Unless you are. If
Mm.
you're in a dangerous place, get out. But
Yeah.
if you're in a safe environment, ground yourself, remind yourself who you are, remind yourself where you are. You know, you don't allow this to stop you from trying new things or going new places. You know, it's not always easy. Like I said, I have to count backwards to be able to get out of my car to go somewhere new. But if it makes
mm,
you feel more comfortable, take a friend with you.
mm.
You know, starting this kind of process isn't always easy, but it's absolutely worth it. And you can build yourself up to it. It's like building muscles.
Exactly. It is very much like that, because we're basically training our bodies, and our bodies remember.
Yeah.
They remember the trauma, which is why we've got the hypervigilance. But also, if we slowly and gradually build up our capacity to try new things, as you said, or go down into basements, and um, we can build our resilience and our bodily resilience to the point where we can overcome hypervigilance
Right.
in the long term.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the physical symptoms that you'll see when somebody is going through a hypersensitive state, hypervigilance, they'll have like psychological and physiological symptoms. So
Mm,
they'll have their pupils will dilate, their heart rate will increase. I know you can't see that. Their blood pressure will increase. I know you can't see that, but a lot of times when those things increase, they can break out in a cold sweat.
mm.
They start getting really nervous. You can see them starting to get fidgety. If you
Yes.
see somebody going through that, you absolutely have the ability to help them to calm down too.
Mm, mm.
So, and
Indeed.
that is really important to recognize too. You know, if you're going through this, have a friend with you, let the friend know that you want help with this, and you should be all right.
Mm, mm. Actually, I don't know why it's come to mind, but I remember a young boy that I was teaching um, about 4 or 5 years ago, and something happened for him that caused a hypervigilant response. And um, we had in the school what they called a like a timeout room, and usually if students were experiencing something, we would send them there. But I knew for this boy, going to timeout was actually just going to exacerbate the situation. So I said, let's go for a walk. And he looked at me, because this wasn't a usual thing in the school. I said, come on, let's just go for a walk. So we walked out of the building and down to the Oval, and we just walked around the Oval for about 10 minutes. And just, he was hyperventilating, and I was trying to help him with his breathing, but he calmed down. And we were then able to deal with the actual situation that was occurring. So that's another way, another strategy, um, walking, walking it out, because it
Yeah.
actually helps your body to go back to some kind of, um, you know, normal equilibrium.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
mm,
Yeah. And, you know, hypervigilance is absolutely a part of PTSD. You know, if
mm,
this kid's dealing with
mm,
PTSD, we have talked previously in different episodes about how exercise can really kind of snap you back out of that, especially going through the depression stage. When you're going through stuff like that, it's hard to get out of it, but you got to find
mm,
ways, you know, and you
mm,
can't wait for somebody else to do it for you.
mm,
Have to take
mm.
control. And that's what this is all about, is taking control of your own trauma recovery. Uh,
It
it's
is.
there's several different ways that people can kind of take a little bit more control over it. So you want to try to catch yourself when you sense that you're going down a spiral through hypervigilance patterns and stuff. Um, you can really work on trying to be in the moment. At least just for a few moments. I know for people with extreme hypervigilance and trauma reactions, it can be really difficult, but focus for just a few moments. And you know, the five senses are really great ways of doing that. Focus on the things you
Mm,
can taste, touch, smell, you know, all of that stuff. Focus on your breathing, focus on your connection. If you need to, take off your shoes and walk in the grass barefoot. That's huge. I didn't realize how much that
yeah,
was helpful until just
yeah,
recently.
yeah.
Um,
Grounding, that's such an important thing. Yeah.
right. And if you don't have the option to go and put your feet in the grass, do it on the floor, do it on the bottom of a
Mm,
chair, do it somewhere where you can put your feet flat on the floor without shoes disconnecting you from the ground, just your feet.
Mm.
Yeah. Writing is huge. So writing down all your negative thoughts, you can start to see the patterns show up. You can start to recognize when you become more hyper vigilant. You can help to control your mind a little bit more in those moments when you recognize those patterns. And you got to look for them. So it's a good idea to write them down.
Mm. It is. So, in terms of, ongoing support and recovery, it's important to seek out medical or professional help. But we ultimately, each individual is responsible for their own recovery. Um,
Absolutely.
like I think I've mentioned before, I've ended up being in a psych ward before when I was at my absolute lowest. And, I'm at a place now where I'm back on track in my life. And my psychiatrist, I've gone in and thanked him at times and said, I've really appreciated the way you've supported me. And he said, it's all down to you. He said, I'm just here to guide you. You're doing the work. You're the one that's actually um, doing your, daily routines of yoga and meditation and walking. So those are my things of doing to calm myself down. And everybody's got their own way of doing it.
Yeah.
I also journal every day. So it's important to find what works for you and believe that you can recover. You can, evolve. All of us can, but it's ultimately, you know, it's our responsibility.
Right. Right. And it's really important to pay attention to when you do start to really spiral and kind of take control over yourself. So if
Mm,
Kyle comes home like late 3 times this week from work, um, my reaction back in the day would have been Kyle's late again. That's the third time this week. Maybe he's losing interest in me. Maybe he doesn't care about me anymore. Maybe he's having an affair. And
mm,
then I start to spiral like, why was he checking his phone? Who was calling him at 7 o'clock this morning? Yeah. And really, honestly, what you're doing is forcing that relationship towards a close. And really,
yeah.
what we would and should do in a normal, healthy relationship is say, you know what, Kyle's late again. It's the third time this week. I'm finding this difficult. We need to sit down and talk about this because I'm really struggling and I don't think he understands why I'm struggling.
Mm,
So
mm,
let's set aside some time tonight, maybe after dinner, to have a chat.
mm, mm.
And I know we've only got a
Yeah.
couple of seconds left here on the program. Um, I think we talked a little bit too long before we got started, but next week or next 2 weeks from today, we're going to be covering heart palpitations.
Mm.
That'd be
Yep, which
interesting.
another response. Yeah. So I think ultimately, what I would like to leave people with as a takeaway is that you only need to do one thing as a circuit breaker
Yeah.
to start changing. You can't do everything all at once.
It's too overwhelming.
So
It's too much.
it is. So I hope people have got some positives out